Malachi Vaughn walked into the gun shop for ammunition. He walked out carrying a widow's secret that would cost him everything he'd built to stay forgotten. The wooden sign above the door read, Wallace Gun Works. But the woman behind the counter looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hands moved too quickly, straightening already straight items, her eyes darting toward the back room every few seconds. When Malachi entered, she flinched as though he'd fired a shot instead of simply opening a door. He'd seen fear before. This was different. This was the kind of terror that came from protecting something worth dying for. He needed rifle ammunition, nothing more. 2 boxes would last him through the season. But the woman kept glancing at the storage room door, and somewhere behind that door, something moved. Not the settling of old wood or the scratch of a rat. Something deliberate, something breathing. 3 years ago, Malachi had walked away from a life where noticing such things kept you alive. He'd found work on a ranch 20 miles north, kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to. The past stayed buried as long as you didn't dig. But the woman's hands were shaking so badly she could barely count his coins, and that sound from the back room came again. A soft thump, like someone trying very hard to be quiet and failing. The woman's name was Laverne Wallace. He'd heard about her in town. Widow for 3 years. Ran the gun shop her husband had left behind. Kept to herself. Never caused trouble. But today, trouble had found her. Or she was hiding it. And Malachi could feel the weight of a choice he didn't want to make pressing against his chest like a hand around his heart. She handed him the wrong ammunition. Her fingers trembled as she placed the boxes on the counter. And Malachi saw they were the wrong caliber entirely. When he pointed this out, her face went white. She looked at the boxes as though seeing them for the first time, then turned toward the storage room again. That's when he heard it clearly. A child's cough, quickly muffled. Laverne's eyes met his. And in that moment, he saw everything. The desperation, the calculation, the question that hung between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Would he pretend he hadn't heard? Would he ask? Would he leave? From outside came the sound of horses. Multiple riders moving slowly like men searching for something. Laverne's hand shot out and gripped Malachi's wrist with surprising strength. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, cracked and raw. They're looking for her. Malachi didn't ask who they were or who she meant. He understood in the way you understand a storm is coming by the smell of the air. The riders outside weren't customers. They were collectors. And whatever Laverne was hiding in that back room was worth more to them than her life, his life, or any sense of mercy. The door to the shop opened. 2 men stepped inside, and everything Malachi had run from came walking back in with them. The first man through the door wore a coat too heavy for the season. His face carried the kind of hardness that came from years of taking what wasn't freely given. The second man was younger, leaner, with eyes that moved across the shop like he was counting inventory. They weren't here to buy supplies. Laverne released Malachi's wrist and stepped back behind the counter, her spine straightening in a way that looked like courage, but felt like desperation. Her voice came out steady, practiced, the voice of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. We're closed for inventory. The older man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. That's unfortunate. We've come a long way, Mrs. Wallace. All the way from Cedar Bend. Your husband used to do business with our employer. Outstanding business, you might say. Malachi stood perfectly still, the way you do when predators are deciding whether you're prey or competition. He kept his hands visible, away from the revolver at his hip. These men had already decided Laverne was prey. He hadn't been categorized yet. My husband's been dead 3 years. Whatever business he had died with him. The younger man laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. See, that's where you're wrong, ma'am. Your husband borrowed a considerable sum, used his ranch as collateral. When he couldn't pay, he offered something else. Something worth a lot more than land. Laverne's knuckles went white against the counter edge. From the back room came another sound, softer this time, like someone shifting weight on old floorboards. The older man's head tilted slightly, a dog catching a scent. You living here alone, Mrs. Wallace? Yes. The word came too fast. Malachi saw the younger man's eyes narrow. He'd caught it too. The hesitation before the lie. The breath held too long afterward. These men hunted people for a living. They knew the sound of truth. And that wasn't it. Malachi picked up the wrong ammunition boxes from the counter, turning them over in his hands as though inspecting them. It gave him a reason to stay, a reason to move. The older man's attention shifted to him for the first time. "You work here?" "Just buying supplies." Malachi met his gaze without challenge, without submission, neutral ground. The man studied him for a long moment, then turned back to Laverne. "We're going to need to look around. Standard collection procedure. You understand." Laverne's hand moved beneath the counter. Malachi knew what she was reaching for before she touched it. Every shop like this kept something under the counter, usually a shotgun, sometimes a pistol, always loaded. He also knew that if she pulled that weapon, both men would draw faster, and she'd be dead before her finger found the trigger. He stepped sideways, placing himself between Laverne and the two men, not blocking them exactly, just occupying space, just making the geometry of violence more complicated. The older man's expression changed. Recognition flickered across his face, not of Malachi's identity, but of his type. He'd just been recategorized. No longer a customer. Something else. Something that might cost them time they didn't want to spend. "You protecting her, friend?" Malachi said nothing. Sometimes silence answered better than words. The tension in the room pulled tight as wire. Outside, more horses approached. The older man heard them too. His jaw tightened. "We'll be back tomorrow, Mrs. Wallace, with the local marshal. Make sure you're ready to cooperate." They left, but leaving meant nothing. Tomorrow meant Laverne had hours, not days, and whatever she was hiding in that back room was running out of time faster than either of them had left to give. The door closed behind them. Laverne's legs gave out. She caught herself against the counter, breathing like she'd run miles instead of stood still. Malachi moved to the window, watching the two men mount their horses. They didn't leave. They rode 30 yards down the street and stopped, taking positions where they could watch both the front door and the alley behind the building. "You should go." Laverne's voice came from somewhere far away, hollow and used up. Malachi turned from the window. She was staring at the storage room door like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. "What did your husband offer them?" She didn't answer. Her hand was still beneath the counter, still touching whatever weapon she'd been reaching for. Her eyes filled with something worse than fear. Shame. The kind that eats you from the inside until there's nothing left but the shell of who you used to be. Malachi crossed to the storage room door. Laverne moved to block him, but she was shaking too hard to be effective. He pushed past her gently and opened the door. The room was small, lined with shelves stacked with dry goods and ammunition crates. In the corner, pressed against the wall behind a stack of flour sacks, sat a girl, 10 years old, maybe 11, dark hair, darker eyes, wearing a dress that had been mended so many times it was more thread than fabric. She looked up at Malachi with the kind of stillness that came from practice, from knowing that staying quiet meant staying alive. "Her name is Nora." Laverne stood in the doorway behind him. Her voice had changed, no longer hollow, filled now with something fierce and final. "My daughter. She's my daughter. And they want to take her because my husband gambled her away before he died. He lost everything. The ranch, the money, everything. When they came to collect 3 years ago, he told them he had a daughter. Told them she'd be worth more than any debt when she was old enough. He wrote it down, signed it, made it legal." Malachi looked at the child. She hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, just watched him with eyes too old for her face. He thought about the kind of man who would use his daughter as collateral, the kind of fear that would drive a woman to hide her child for 3 years, the kind of collection agents who traveled this far for one girl. "They think she's older." Laverne's voice cracked. She was 7 when he signed the paper. They thought she'd be 17 by now, old enough for whatever they had planned. But I hid her, kept her here. No one in town knows she exists. I told everyone she died with her father, but they found out somehow. Someone talked or someone saw, and now they're here. How long have you kept her in this room? 3 years. Malachi felt something cold settle in his chest. 3 years in a storage room. 3 years of silence and darkness and fear. The girl's legs were thin, her skin pale from lack of sunlight. She looked like a ghost, already half disappeared from the world. "She's sick." Laverne's voice broke completely. "Coughs all the time. Can't keep food down. I tried to get medicine, but the doctor asks questions. I couldn't risk it. I thought if I could just wait them out, if I could just keep her hidden long enough, they'd forget. But they didn't forget. They never forget." Malachi looked at the two women, one grown and broken, one small and fading. He thought about the life he'd built on forgetting, the peace that came from not being involved, the safety of keeping your head down and your hands clean, Those men outside aren't leaving. They'll watch this building until tomorrow, then come back with the law. If you run, they'll track you. If you stay, they'll take her. I know. Then what's your plan? Laverne looked at him with eyes that had already accepted the worst possible outcome. She had no plan. She'd been surviving minute by minute for 3 years, and now the minutes had run out. Malachi turned back to the girl. Nora's hand rested on her chest. Fingers splayed over her heart like she was trying to hold something inside that wanted to break free. He recognized that gesture. His sister used to do the same thing before the fever took her 40 years ago. This child wasn't just sick. She was dying, and time was a luxury none of them had left to spend. Malachi closed the storage room door and walked back to the front window. The 2 men remained in position, patient as vultures. The sun had started its descent, painting the street in long shadows. He counted the hours until morning. Not enough time to run far. Too much time to do nothing. She needs a doctor. Laverne moved behind the counter, her hands resuming their nervous straightening of items that didn't need straightening. I told you. The doctor asks questions. Then she dies tonight, and those men get nothing but a corpse tomorrow. The words came out harder than Malachi intended, but softness wouldn't save anyone now. Laverne's hands stopped moving. She looked at him with something between hope and horror, like she couldn't decide if he was offering help or delivering a death sentence. You don't understand. If anyone finds out she exists, if anyone sees her, word will spread. This town talks. Those men have connections. They'll know within the hour. Malachi turned from the window. Outside, one of the watchers had dismounted and was leaning against a post, settling in for a long wait. The other remained on horseback, eyes fixed on the building. The nearest town with a doctor who doesn't know you is 15 miles east. Takes 4 hours by wagon. 5 if the road's bad. We don't have a wagon. My husband sold it before he died. Malachi thought about his horse tied outside. Strong enough to carry 2, maybe 3 if one was a child. But riding meant exposure, meant being seen. Meant those men outside would follow the moment they moved. There's a back door? Leads to an alley. But they're watching it. Malachi walked through the shop, past shelves of flour and coffee and ammunition, into the storage room again. Nora hadn't moved. She watched him with that same terrible stillness, like she'd learned long ago that movement attracted attention, and attention meant danger. He knelt beside her, and she flinched. I'm not going to hurt you. His voice came out gentler than he'd used in years. The girl's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she nodded once, a tiny movement of her head. Can you ride a horse? She nodded again. Can you stay quiet even if you're scared? Another nod. Malachi looked at Laverne standing in the doorway. There's a canyon 2 miles north. Rock formations thick enough to lose a dozen men. If we can get there before they realize we're gone, we can circle back east toward the next town. But we need a distraction. Laverne's face went through a series of calculations, fear and hope warring for dominance. When she spoke, her voice was steady. There's lamp oil in the storage room, enough to make a decent fire. If the shop burns, everyone in town will come running. Including those 2, you'll lose everything. I lost everything 3 years ago when I put my daughter in a box and told the world she was dead. This shop is just wood and nails. Malachi studied her. 3 years of hiding had stripped away whatever softness she might have once possessed. What remained was iron wrapped in flesh, a mother's love sharpened to a blade. She would burn down the world if it meant one more day for her daughter. The fire needs to start after we're gone. Give us time to reach the canyon. How? Malachi looked around the storage room. Shelves of dry goods, wooden crates, lamp oil, everything a fire needed except time. Then he saw it. A kerosene lamp with a cracked base, the kind that leaked slowly if tipped over. He picked it up, felt the weight of the fuel inside. We tip this near the front door. Place a candle underneath on a stack of newspapers. The oil drips, the candle burns down, eventually the flame reaches the oil, gives us maybe 30 minutes before it catches. And if those men see the smoke before we're clear, then we ride faster. Laverne looked at her daughter. Nora had started coughing again, soft and wet, the kind of cough that came from deep in the chest where bad things grew. The girl covered her mouth with her hand, trying to muffle the sound even now, even here where only allies could hear. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Stay and lose her daughter to men who'd bought her like livestock. Run and maybe lose her to sickness or capture. or burn everything down and hope the smoke bought them enough time to disappear into the wilderness where the law couldn't follow and collectors couldn't find them. Laverne moved to the shelves and started pulling down the lamp oil. We do it now. Before I change my mind. Before I remember all the reasons this won't work. Malachi stood and moved toward the front of the shop. Through the window, the two watchers remained in position. One was smoking. The other had closed his eyes, but Malachi knew he wasn't sleeping. Men like that never truly slept. They just waited with their eyes closed until something worth waking for happened. In a few minutes, something worth waking for would burn bright enough to see from miles away. They worked in silence. Laverne stacked newspapers near the front door, while Malachi positioned the cracked kerosene lamp above them on a crate. He wedged a thick candle beneath the lamp's base, the flame barely an inch from where the oil would eventually drip. The setup was crude, but effective. 20 minutes, maybe 30 if the candle burned slow. Laverne gathered what she could carry. A small bag of dried meat, 2 canteens of water, a thin blanket. 3 years of hiding had taught her to pack light and fast. She moved through the shop like someone saying goodbye to a grave, touching items without sentiment, just marking their existence one last time before letting them go. Malachi went to the back door and eased it open. The alley was narrow, boxed in by buildings on both sides. 30 feet to the left, the alley opened onto the main street where one watcher sat. 30 feet to the right, it connected to a side passage that led behind the general store and eventually to the edge of town. That was their path. His horse was tied out front. Useless now. They'd have to move on foot until they could steal or borrow another mount. Malachi calculated distances. 2 miles to the canyon. Another 8 to the neighboring town after they circled back. 10 miles total with a sick child who could barely stand, and a woman who hadn't left this building in 3 years. The mathematics of survival didn't favor them. Laverne emerged from the storage room with Nora. The girl moved like something made of glass, each step deliberate and careful. Her breathing came shallow and quick. Malachi could hear the rattle in her chest from across the room. Whatever sickness had taken root, there was winning. He knelt in front of the child again. Up close, he could see the fever flush on her cheeks, the way her eyes didn't quite focus. She was burning from the inside. Her body fighting a war it didn't have the strength to win. You stay between your mother and me. You don't make a sound. You don't stop moving unless we stop. Understand? Nora nodded. Her hand found her mother's and gripped it with surprising strength. Malachi saw the way Laverne's face changed when she felt that grip, saw the fear transform into something harder. A mother's love was the most dangerous force in the world when cornered. It would burn down towns and sacrifice futures and drag everyone nearby into its wake. They moved to the back door. Malachi checked the alley again. Empty. The sun had dropped lower, shadows deepening. Good for hiding. Bad for seeing what hid in return. When we move fast. No looking back. No second thoughts. Laverne pulled the blanket over Nora's head and shoulders, concealing her distinctive features. From a distance, she might pass for a bundle of supplies. Up close, the illusion wouldn't hold. They needed distance more than they needed time. Malachi opened the door. The alley air hit them, cooler than the shop's interior, carrying the smell of horse manure and rotting vegetables. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed. Normal sounds of a town settling into evening. None of those people knew what was about to happen. None of them knew that in 20 minutes, their street would be on fire, and 3 people would be running for their lives through the wilderness. They stepped into the alley. Malachi led, Laverne and Nora close behind. He moved along the wall, keeping to the shadows. Behind them, inside the shop, the candle burned steadily downward. Each second brought the flame closer to the oil. Each step carried them farther from the only home Nora had known. They reached the side passage. Malachi paused, listening. Voices from the main street. The sound of a wagon passing. Nothing that suggested alarm or discovery. He motioned them forward. That's when Nora coughed. It wasn't loud, just a small wet sound that any other time wouldn't matter. But in the silence of their escape, it echoed like a gunshot. Malachi froze. Laverne's hand clamped over her daughter's mouth. Too late to stop the sound, only in time to prevent another. From the main street came a new sound. Footsteps. Someone walking toward the alley entrance. Not running, not alarmed, just walking. But walking in their direction, and walking meant seeing. And seeing meant everything they'd planned would collapse before it began. Malachi pressed himself against the wall. pulling Laverne and Nora deeper into the shadows. The footsteps grew closer. A figure appeared at the alley entrance, silhouetted against the fading light. The younger of the two watchers. He'd heard something. Maybe the cough, maybe just instinct. He stood at the alley entrance, looking into the shadows where three people held their breath and prayed to gods they'd stopped believing in years ago. The man took one step into the alley, then another. His hand rested on his belt, near where Malachi knew a weapon would be. He was maybe 15 feet away now, close enough to see them if he looked hard enough, close enough to end everything with a shout. Inside the shop, the candle burned on, indifferent to prayer. The man stood in the alley, his head turning slowly as his eyes adjusted to the shadows. Malachi's hand moved to his revolver, knowing that drawing it would mean killing, and killing would mean more men coming, and more men meant no escape. But if the watcher saw them, there would be no choice left to make. Nora trembled against her mother. Laverne's hand remained over the girl's mouth, her other arm wrapped around her daughter's thin frame. Malachi could see the desperation in her eyes, the silent plea that asked him not to do what they both knew might be necessary. The watcher took another step into the alley, then stopped. From somewhere behind them, deeper in the passage, came the sound of a cat yowling. The man's attention shifted toward the noise. He stood there for a long moment, deciding. Finally, he turned and walked back toward the street, muttering something about rats and wasted time. They waited, counted to 30, then moved. Malachi led them through the side passage, past the general store, past a small stable where horses shifted and snorted in their stalls. They reached the edge of town where buildings gave way to open ground. The wilderness stretched before them, dark and limitless, offering both sanctuary and 1,000 ways to die. Behind them, the town continued its evening routine, unaware that in minutes it would transform into chaos. Malachi thought about the candle burning down, the flame creeping closer to oil, the moment when everything would ignite. They ran. Nora's legs gave out after 50 yards. Malachi swept her up without breaking stride, feeling how little she weighed, how her body burned with fever against his chest. She didn't cry out, didn't protest, just pressed her face against his shoulder and held on with what strength remained. Laverne kept pace beside him, her breathing harsh but steady. 3 years of fear had prepared her for this. She'd known someday she would have to run. She'd just hoped that day would never come. They covered a mile before the first explosion of sound reached them. Not an explosion exactly, more like a roar. Fire finding oil and wood and opportunity, consuming everything in its path with the hunger of something too long denied. Malachi looked back. Orange light bloomed against the darkening sky. Flames reached above the roofline, visible for miles. Within minutes, every able body in town would be fighting that fire, including the two watchers. But fire drew attention in other ways. Smoke signals. Visible proof that something had gone wrong. When the men realized Laverne and Nora were gone, they'd know exactly when the escape had occurred. They'd know which direction to search. The fire bought time, but it also started a clock that would run faster than any of them could. They reached the canyon as darkness settled fully. Rock formations rose around them like the bones of ancient giants, creating passages and hiding places where men could disappear. Malachi set Nora down gently. The girl swayed but managed to stay upright. Her breathing had worsened during the run, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a rattle that promised nothing good. Laverne collapsed against a rock wall, her hands shaking as she pulled out one of the canteens. She tried to give water to Nora, but the girl coughed it back up, her body rejecting even this small mercy. "We need to keep moving. Circle east like we planned." Laverne looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and understood more. "She can't. Look at her." Malachi looked. Nora sat slumped against the rock, her skin pale in the moonlight, her chest heaving with the effort of breathing. She'd used everything she had left to run this far. There was nothing remaining for 8 more miles. Then we wait until morning. Let her rest. Morning is when they come looking. Morning is when they realize the fire was a distraction. Morning is when they bring dogs and trackers and enough men to search every canyon between here and the border. Malachi knew she was right. Stopping meant dying slowly. Moving meant dying quickly. There was no third option that ended with everyone alive. He looked at the girl, then at her mother, then at the vast darkness surrounding them. Somewhere in that darkness were men who'd bought a child like livestock. Somewhere behind them was a town with a burning building and questions that would need answers. Somewhere ahead was a doctor who might save one life while risking 3 others. The mathematics of survival hadn't improved. They'd just traded one impossible situation for another, and the night was far from over. Malachi made a decision that felt like defeat and survival wrapped together. They would rest for 2 hours. Long enough for Nora to gather strength. Short enough to stay ahead of whoever would come hunting at dawn. He found a depression in the rocks, sheltered from wind and hidden from casual view. Laverne wrapped Nora in the thin blanket and held her close, sharing warmth between mother and daughter. Malachi sat at the entrance to their shelter, watching the darkness. Behind them, the orange glow had faded but smoke still rose, a gray column against black sky. The fire would burn itself out eventually. The questions it raised would burn longer. "You didn't have to help us." Laverne's voice came from the darkness behind him. Malachi didn't turn around. "I know. Why did you?" He thought about answers. About the sister who died when he was young. About the life he'd run from. About the man he'd tried to become by forgetting the man he'd been. None of those answers felt true enough to speak aloud. "Your husband signed a paper trading his daughter for a debt. That makes him worse than the men who came to collect. Someone needed to say no. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Silence settled between them. Nora's breathing filled the space, wet and labored. Malachi had heard that sound before. In field hospitals. In rooms where family gathered to say goodbye. It was the sound of lungs filling with fluid. Of a body losing its fight against infection. Without medicine, the girl had days at most. Maybe less. "Tell me about him. Your husband." Laverne was quiet for so long, Malachi thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 years of silence. "He was a good man once. Before the gambling. Before the drinking. Before he realized the ranch was failing and we'd lose everything. He tried to win it back. Bet bigger. Lost more. The men from Cedar Bend offered him a loan. He took it. When he couldn't repay, they wanted the ranch. He said the ranch was worthless. Offered them something that would be worth more in 10 years. He sold his daughter's future to buy time he never got. He hanged himself 2 weeks later. Left a note apologizing to me. Nothing for Nora, just me. Like she didn't matter enough for goodbye." Malachi heard the hate in her voice. The kind of hate that came from loving someone who'd betrayed everything love meant. Laverne had spent 3 years hiding her daughter from the consequences of a dead man's choices. Now those consequences had found them anyway. Because debts always came due and the innocent always paid for the guilty. The 2 hours passed too quickly. Nora woke worse than she'd been before. Her fever had climbed higher, her skin now burning to the touch. When Laverne tried to wake her fully, the girl's eyes rolled back. Malachi had seen this before too. The body shutting down, conserving what little strength remained for vital functions. Consciousness was a luxury the dying couldn't afford. "We have to move now." Malachi lifted Nora again. She weighed nothing. He could feel her heart racing against his chest, her body fighting battles it couldn't win. They left their shelter and began working their way east through the canyon. The moon provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles, just enough shadow to hide the worst fears. They'd covered maybe 3 miles when Malachi heard it. Dogs. Distant, but distinct. The baying of hounds on a scent. They'd brought trackers like Laverne said they would. Brought them early, not waiting for dawn. Someone in town must have seen them running. Someone must have talked. The sound grew closer. Multiple dogs now. And behind them the sound of horses. Lots of horses. They'd brought a hunting party. This wasn't about collecting a debt anymore. This was about making an example. About showing what happened when someone burned down a building and ran. Malachi looked at Laverne. She'd heard it too. Her face had gone beyond fear into something approaching acceptance. The acceptance of someone who'd known all along this moment would come. Who'd hoped it wouldn't but never truly believed in that hope. "Go, take her. I'll lead them away." "No." Malachi's voice came out harder than he'd intended. He adjusted Nora in his arms, feeling her fading with each labored breath. "We stay together. There's a ranch 5 miles northeast. Man named Gentry owns it. Owes me a favor from years back. He'll have horses, maybe a wagon, maybe help. And if he doesn't, then we die together instead of separately." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was more than they'd had moments before. The baying grew louder. The hunters were closing the distance, following a scent trail that would lead them straight to 3 people who had nowhere left to run, and a child who might not survive long enough to be caught. They ran through darkness that felt like running through water, every step harder than the last. Nora had stopped making sounds entirely. Her body lay limp in Malachi's arms, only the faint rise and fall of her chest confirming she still lived. Laverne stumbled beside him, exhaustion written in every movement, but she never slowed, never asked to stop. The dogs grew closer. Malachi could hear individual voices now, men shouting to each other, coordinating their search. They had maybe 10 minutes before the hunters closed the distance completely. The Gentry Ranch appeared ahead, a cluster of dark buildings against darker sky. No lights, no movement. Either nobody was home, or everyone was sleeping. Malachi pounded on the main house door. Once, twice. Behind them, the baying reached a fever pitch. The dogs had found their trail and were closing fast. The door opened. A man stood there, older than Malachi remembered, holding a rifle and looking at 3 desperate people on his porch, with the expression of someone who'd seen trouble before and had no appetite for more. "Gentry, it's Malachi Vaughn. I need that favor you owe me." Recognition flickered across the older man's face. Then calculation. He looked past them toward the sound of approaching hunters, looked at the unconscious child in Malachi's arms, looked at Laverne's face and saw everything that mattered written there. "How many are hunting you?" "Enough." "What did you do?" "Stopped them from taking a child they'd bought." Gentry studied them for 3 seconds that felt like hours, then stepped aside. "Barn has a wagon, 2 horses hitched, medical supplies in the tack room. Take what you need and go out the back way. There's a trail through the woods leads to the eastern road. They'll search here, but I'll buy you time." Malachi moved past him, Laverne close behind. Gentry called after them. "Vaughn, whatever you're running from, it ends tonight. You understand? No coming back." Malachi understood. This was the kind of choice that closed doors permanently, the kind that meant everything after would be different from everything before. They reached the barn, true to his word. Gentry had a wagon ready, 2 strong horses already in harness. Malachi laid Nora in the wagon bed while Laverne found blankets and the medical supplies, laudanum for pain, willow bark for fever, bandages and carbolic acid. Not enough to cure what was killing the girl, but enough to keep her comfortable while they got her to someone who could. Behind them, the hunters reached the ranch. Malachi heard Gentry's voice loud and authoritative, telling them nobody had come this way. They were wasting time. The fugitives had probably circled south. The hunters didn't believe him. Malachi heard doors slamming open, boots on wooden floors, the systematic search of someone looking for people who didn't want to be found. Laverne climbed into the wagon seat. Malachi took the reins. They moved out through the back of the barn, onto the trail Gentry had described. Behind them, the sounds of searching continued, but they were moving away, heading in the wrong direction, at least for now. The trail was rough but passable. The horses knew the way, following paths they'd traveled before. Malachi drove them hard, knowing that behind them eventually the hunters would realize they'd been misled. Eventually, they'd come back. Eventually, Gentry would pay for the help he'd given. But eventually was an hour away, maybe 2. And right now, hours were the difference between living and dying. Dawn broke as they reached the eastern road. Laverne had given Nora the laudanum, and the girl's breathing had eased slightly, the desperate rattle quieting to something almost peaceful. Not cured, not saved, just suffering less, which was sometimes the best you could hope for. The town appeared ahead, small but substantial, with a sign that read Henderson Creek. Laverne pointed to a building with a medical shingle hanging outside. "That's it. That's where we stop running." They pulled the wagon up to the doctor's door. Malachi carried Nora inside, while Laverne explained everything to a gray-haired man who listened without judgment and got to work immediately. He examined the girl, his face grave, but not without hope. "Pneumonia. Advanced. But I've seen worse survive. She'll need weeks of care, maybe months. And she'll need to stay here where I can watch her." Laverne's hand found